When Dad announced he'd split the business equally, I saw Lisa's eyes gleam with greed. A couple of weeks later, she showed up with DNA results claiming I wasn't his son. But if she thought she'd outsmarted me, she really didn't know me at all. That's when the real game began. My name's Jake, and I'm 25 years old. In my family, relationships are a bit like poker. Whoever hides their intentions best wins, especially with my sister Lisa. She's 28, and trust me, she loves being the big sister who's always in control. Growing up, she always had that spark in her eye, an urge to control everything, to stay one step ahead. When Dad, owner of a fairly large company, started to decline in health, Lisa suddenly got very involved. And that's where my suspicion began. Dad didn't want us fighting over the company after he passed, so he decided to settle everything early. The plan was simple. Split the business 50-50 between Lisa and me. Fair enough, right? Except that fair wasn't exactly in Lisa's playbook. The minute the inheritance was mentioned, she started showing her cards. She kept reminding Dad to check the paperwork, to verify everything. She said it was important to be sure everything was in order. It looked like concern, but I could tell she had something up her sleeve. Then she got weirdly interested in DNA testing labs. Yep, DNA tests. "I just want to make sure everything's fair, Jake," she'd say with her trademark smile that gave me chills. At first, I didn't think much of it, assuming it was just her way of being important. But one day, she let it slip that she'd personally be taking the samples to the lab, and something in my head clicked. She was clearly hiding something, though I had no idea yet how far she'd go to get what she wanted. And that's how this whole mess started. Trust me, I wasn't ready for what came next. A few weeks later, Dad called us in, and with a stone-cold expression, revealed the DNA test results. The evidence showed I wasn't his biological son. Just like that, out of nowhere. Honestly, I nearly choked. My first thought was, this has to be some kind of joke. And sitting there was Lisa, doing her best stunned act, practically fanning herself like she was on the verge of tears. But her eyes sparkled too much, like a cat that had finally caught the mouse. And the mouse was me. Lisa launched right into her little play, turning the scene into some Shakespearean tragedy. "Dad, what are we going to do? We can't let a stranger run the family business." She was so theatrical about it, acting as though she was in shock. Sweet, right? I wanted to roll my eyes and tell her that she should audition for the local drama club with that level of exaggeration. But I kept my cool. She then suggested rewriting the will to make things fair. Of course, her idea of fair meant she'd get it all. I didn't need to be Sherlock to know something was off. Even if I hadn't been aware of her habit of adjusting situations, it was all way too convenient. Lisa had always been a control freak, but her phony shock was so obvious I almost laughed. But I held that for later. Instead, I decided it was time to investigate what was really going on. A bit of digging through our mutual contacts led me to an interesting tidbit. A couple of days before the test was done, Lisa had met with someone from the DNA lab. Of course, she had. First, she signed off on the will, then came the random test, and now this. It was all playing out like a script she'd written herself. I wondered if this was a soap opera, or a classic con job. I knew I couldn't just sit back and let her win this charade. I had found enough clues to suspect her tricks, but I needed solid proof. It was time to track her every move and see how she'd react when the truth came out. Once I realized my sister wouldn't stop at anything, I called an old friend, a private investigator named Bill. He looked like your typical biker in a leather jacket, but his instincts for sniffing out lies were sharp. I filled him in, and he jumped on the case. Bill agreed to dig up whatever he could on my virtuous sister. A few days later, Bill came back with the goods. He tracked down the lab technician Lisa, coincidentally, met before the test. Turns out, this guy wasn't as neutral as he seemed. Bill found out Lisa had slipped him a hefty sum. Not just a nice dinner, but a check with several zeros. He'd been all too willing to tamper with the test results at her request, changing the data to show I wasn't Dad's biological son. I was stunned. For Lisa, truth was apparently meaningless when her interests were at stake. That's when I knew I had the cards in my hand. Not only did I have intel, but I'd also recorded Bill's conversation with the lab tech on tape. Well, if she wanted to go that far, I'd show her what a real performance looked like. Bill prepared all the documents and transaction records, and I invited him to our next meeting with the lawyers. The day of the meeting arrived. Lisa strolled into the lawyer's office, looking like she'd hit the jackpot. Honestly, she didn't even try to hide her joy. Calm, collected, playing the part of Miss Heir Apparent. As the inheritance details were being discussed, I acted like I couldn't care less. But as soon as there was a pause, I raised my hand. "Actually, I'd like to add something," I said. And that's when the fireworks began. I calmly introduced Bill and asked him to share what he'd found. Lisa tensed up, and her confidence started to crack. When Bill began talking about the bribe and the honest DNA test, Lisa's face went pale. The lawyer sat there, stunned, as I laid out all the evidence. Recordings, bank transfers, and even photos of Lisa meeting with the lab tech. When Bill, my investigator, started laying out the evidence, you could feel the tension in the room thicken. He politely and coldly began with the photos. Lisa and the lab tech in a cafe, whispering over coffee like some undercover agents. All eyes turned to her, and I saw a hint of panic cross her face. "And now, if I could draw your attention here," Bill continued, showing the bank statements with a substantial deposit to the lab tech's account. "Looks like someone's very generous when it comes to DNA consultations." By now, Lisa was ready to explode. She shot out of her chair, nearly knocking it over, and tried to defend herself. "This isn't what you think. We were just discussing the tests. Everything's above board." The lawyers weren't amused. One of them, an older man with a stern face, folded his arms and glared at her, saying, "Lisa, is this true?" She stammered about needing to be thorough for the sake of the business, insisting it was all for the family, and that I had nothing to do with it. Honestly, it was the saddest act I'd ever seen. "Oh, Lisa, do you really think anyone here believes your nonsense?" I scoffed. "First, you orchestrate the biggest scam of your life, trying to cut me out, and now you're playing the victim?" She kept going, trying to convince everyone of her noble intentions and how it was all just for the company's future. But the lawyers had stopped listening. One of them, clearly the lead, looked her square in the eye and declared, "Lisa, your actions are a violation of the will's terms. This deception means you forfeit your right to the inheritance." Her face dropped, like a kid being told there's no Santa Claus. She stood there for a few seconds, then turned red with rage. "You don't understand! I was the only one who cared about this company!" She waved her hands around, trying to plead her case, but everyone was just exchanging glances, while the lawyers packed up the paperwork, visibly disappointed. Realizing that yelling and threats wouldn't get her anywhere, Lisa threw me a venomous glare and stormed out, slamming the door so hard that everyone in the room flinched. Good riddance.